We will be moving on to our next talk, which is by Steven Whitfield at Zoo Miami. And the title of this talk is Burrow Characteristics and Habitat Association of Gopher Tortoises in Urban Pine Rockland Reserves.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me all and see my screen? All right, great. Well, thanks to you all for coming, and thanks to Vanessa and Jennifer for putting this together. It's great to have a chance to talk about work. So I want to start out by giving a shout out to my collaborators on this project. This project was mostly done with undergrads from Florida International University, who are great. The work that I'm going to talk about today was funded, like most projects we do at Zoo Miami, it's funded by visitation fees to the zoo. So when people come visit the zoo, they're directly contributing to conservation and research efforts designed to protect endangered species. So just to give you a little bit of general biology of gopher tortoises, they are one of the coolest species in Florida. They are a threatened species according to the state of Florida, and they are pending a threatened listing under the Endangered Species Act. They're found throughout the southeastern United States, although you can see this range map that I have here comes from a recent summary paper of gopher tortoises, and you'll see that there's a big gap in the distribution in Southeast Florida, representing Miami-Dade, Broward, and southern Palm Beach counties. This is illustrative of a lack of knowledge of the tortoises really even being here. The tortoises are cool in themselves, but one of the things that's really neat about them is that they have this awesome role as an ecosystem engineer. They dig deep burrows that are home to lots of other species. So throughout the range of the tortoise, more than 300 species of insects and vertebrates have been found using the burrows of the tortoises. There are species that only live in gopher tortoise burrows and nowhere else. And if you are a species that is dependent on a threatened species, you're likely to be threatened yourself. And there are many threatened species that use tortoise burrows throughout the range. They also have important roles as herbivores. They influence plant community structure, and they're important as seed dispersers. I kind of think as gopher tortoises as the species that runs the pine rockland, because they're creating habitat for vertebrates, for arthropods, and affecting plant community structure. In South Florida, this is really an unusual habitat for the tortoises. Most tortoises live in pine flatwoods with sandy soils. But in South Florida, in the pine rocklands, this is really unusual. Most of South Florida is wetlands, and wetlands don't work well if you're a burrowing tortoise. The upland habitat in South Florida is restricted to the pine rocklands, and it's not even clear that burrowing is possible in habitats as rocky as pine rocklands. In addition to the geological challenges, the tortoises are really penned in by urban environments. They remain only in small areas, small protected areas. Traffic is a major problem for them. As long-lived animals, they can't take additional anthropogenic mortality. Fire suppression and harassment, direct harassment by people are challenges. And the tortoises in Miami are really interesting because they're at the southernmost part of the range. So it's the warmest areas that the tortoises live in, and they're really on the forefront of climate change impacts in terms of temperature warming. The lack of knowledge of kind of what tortoises are doing in South Florida is represented in the state's Gopher Tortoise Management Plan, where they basically say that they don't know what's going on with gopher tortoises. Are they here? Are they supposed to be here? What's their basic biology? So I'm going to review on one slide what we know about gopher tortoises in Miami-Dade. We do know that there have been tortoises in the Miami area for a long time. They have been found in fossil sites in Miami-Dade County, including at Deering, going back 10 or 15,000 years. So it blows my mind, but it's possible that there have been tortoise populations at the Deering estate for 10 or 15,000 years. The first records we have of gopher tortoises by Europeans are of early settlers in Miami who ate them. So we have records primarily by pioneer women who describe cooking gopher tortoises in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The naturalists from the early 1900s rarely wrote about gopher tortoises. Surprisingly, while John Conkle Small spent a lot of time at Deering Estate, he never mentioned gopher tortoises as far as I can tell, but he seems to be so focused on plants that I'm not sure he ever wrote about a vertebrate. One estimate, a statewide estimate of gopher tortoises that came out in 1982 said that there are probably 700 gopher tortoises remaining in Miami-Dade County, and they predicted that the population would be extinct by the year 2000 because of the rate of urbanization. Since the year 2000, there have been 3 published records of gopher tortoises in Miami-Dade County. 2 of those were individual tortoises, and 1 was based on our work, where we reported just a few. So we're not working with a lot of information here, and even talking with the state, they weren't aware if there were actually populations in South Florida, if the populations are viable, what kind of habitats they need. So these are some of the basic questions that we're working on. The tortoises, we know they're restricted to upland habitats. And when you look at the former extent of the pine rocklands, here it is in light green. This is the original extent, and this is what we have now. These 2 red boxes here are the 2 study sites I'm going to talk about today. This is the Richmond Tract, which is Zoo Miami and surrounding properties, and then the Deering Estate. I do want to mention that these are probably the southernmost remaining populations of gopher tortoises throughout the range. So our research questions are really basic. What are the physical characteristics of tortoise burrows in pine rockland environments with limited soils? Do the tortoises actually have burrows, or are they just kind of hunkering down underneath leaf litter or in shallow soils? And what are the habitat features of rocklands associated with tortoise burrows? So just to let you know, first, tortoises do have burrows. We do occasionally see them overnight outside of burrows, but they are predominantly spending their time in burrows. For a study design, we worked at Zoo Miami's pine rocklands and the pine rocklands of the Deering Estate. Zoo Miami has about 102 hectares of pinelands, and then there's adjacent rockland reserves as well. Deering Estate has 36 hectares in 2 separate parcels, one up north and a smaller one down south. So on this map, these black points are gopher tortoise burrows that we have from previous mapping work, and then the white points are random points that we generated in GIS. At each of the burrows, we measured the width of the burrow, and conveniently, the width of the burrow corresponds to the size of the tortoise. So by measuring the burrows, we get an estimate for population structure. How many adults are there? How many juveniles are there? Is there a range in between? We measured the length of the burrows, so the distance from the entrance of the burrow to the very back. And we have a gopher tortoise burrow camera, which is basically a large endoscope that we put down to the camera to measure the length. And then we gauge whether the burrows are active or inactive based on whether there's freshly kicked up sand, whether there's debris in the entrance, things like that. Then we measured 11 habitat variables: understory density, canopy cover, soil depth, soil compaction, and then ground cover, things like leaf litter, bare ground, grass, etc. So just to start off with burrow characteristics, this is the burrow width. I'm going to show a number of slides where I compare active and inactive burrows at the Deering Estate and Zoo Miami. So yellow is active, green is inactive, and then left is Deering, right is Miami. So in terms of burrow widths here, one of the things that's really important is that we see both adult and juvenile burrows at both sites. So both sites represent breeding populations. We see slightly wider burrows at Zoo Miami than at Deering, which may mean that we have slightly larger tortoises or things like that. And then active burrows tend to be wider than inactive burrows, which is not a surprise because they're kind of better maintained. When we look at burrow length, we find that burrows are far shorter here than anywhere else in the range. Burrows are a lot longer at the Deering estate than at Zoo Miami, but still, most of these burrows are less than 1 meter in length, which is really short. A lot of the places in the range, the burrows are 10 meters or so long. But I don't know how a tortoise could possibly burrow for 10 meters through pine rockland soil. And I was really impressed seeing any burrows that are over 3 meters just because there's not a lot of soil to begin with. When we look at the kind of habitat associations, this is a multi-dimensional scaling plot. So it's a way to take those 11 variables and kind of break it down visually to show whether there's differences between burrows and random points and between sites. So the closed points here are tortoise burrows, and the open points are random points. And you can see because those differ, there's differences in habitat features between the burrows versus random points. So that means the tortoises are selecting for certain habitat variables. And over here on the right, we have active versus inactive burrows. And again, we see some differentiation, but it's not as strong. This all makes perfect sense. Tortoises prefer certain habitat features, and it's more important for burrows and random points than it is for active versus inactive burrows. When we look at the 11 habitat variables and which ones are most important, this is the result of a Semper analysis, which tells us which of the habitat variables are most important or most selected by gopher tortoises, and they are ranked from most important to least important. I'm not going to get down into all of these, but I want to look at the top 3, which are leaf litter cover, grass cover, and canopy cover. And this is interesting because these are all habitat features that are associated with openness or fire. So if you have less canopy, you have more grass and less leaf litter. And these top 3 variables all seem to be showing tortoises prefer areas with open canopy corresponding with fire. And then the 4th factor, which was important, is soil depth. And this is not related to fire, but it's interesting because, of course, burrowing tortoises would like deeper soils. I just want to kind of emphasize more the importance of soil depth. And going into this, I was really curious as to how deep are the soils in the pine rocklands. The way we were measuring soil depth was just to take a 1.2 meter rod and sticking it into the ground. So our maximum depth here is 1.2 meters, but you can see that very few of the sites actually had soils that deep. And at Deering, soils were much deeper on average than at Zoo Miami. At the zoo, we had no average soil depths more than 1 meter deep. So this probably explains why the burrows are deeper at Deering than at the zoo. And then we find that burrow length correlates really well with soil depth. So it's interesting because it seems to be geology that limits the distribution and probably abundance of the gopher tortoises, which is really unusual, and it's not how it works through most of the range. But it's also interesting because even within just the 2 rockland plots at Deering and across the rockland plots at the zoo, we see a north to south gradient in soil depth. So there's deeper soil at the northern rocklands of Deering and deeper soil at the northern rocklands of the zoo. And if we kind of just spatially extrapolate, we see at the northern parts of the pine rocklands, we have lots of it kind of transitions into sand scrub. And when you get down into the Everglades and into the Florida Keys, the rocklands there have no soil. So this probably determines the abundance of the distribution of gopher tortoises within the pine rocklands, even beyond these 2 sites. So just kind of starting to wrap up, we see despite rocky soils, tortoises are finding places to burrow. The burrows usually provide a buffer from extreme temperatures and refuge from fire. But it's not clear how much protection these burrows will provide. It may be that South Florida's temperatures never get so hot that really cool refugia are necessary. Certainly it doesn't get that cold here. One of the implications for management is that the two features that we kind of, that tortoises seems to like are open canopy and deep soil. And we can open canopy by birding, but there is not an easy way to increase soil depth. So management should probably focus on fire in areas that already have deep soil. And I think it's just really interesting that Miami's tortoises are really on the forefront of impacts from climate change and urbanization. And these tortoises are long lived. They can live for about 100 years. So a tortoise in Central Florida that hatches today may be living in an environment a lot more like Miami by the middle of its lifetime. And so I think it's really important that we sort out management for climate impacts and for urbanization now, so that tortoises throughout the range will have good methods for how to protect them. And typically, with these tortoise populations, we'd like a viable population, a large contiguous area, and lots of tortoises. That may not be possible in these urban reserves, but given the important ecosystem impact of the gopher tortoises, it's probably worth maintaining these populations even if they can't be viable without human help in the long term. I think I'm at time, so I will wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steven. I think we have time for one question. If you would unmute yourself.
I've got a question.
Sure.
Do you know if there's any tortoises, gopher tortoises left on Cape Sable in the park?
I don't. So there was clearly a population there in the 80s, and there was a resurvey around 2000 that found very few of them. And I don't know that they've been seen there recently. That area was hit very hard by storm surges over the past 15 years. And there is some thought that the dunes may have just been washed out and that population may be lost. I don't know. But that would be the one population that we know of that could be south of these in Miami.
Great, thanks.
Thank you so much, Steven and Cliff, for your question. Our